Hello and welcome to the podcast whose name I can never remember. Have I? Did those
And
feet?
did those feet.
The podcast that celebrates English football and sometimes British football from 1945 to 1970. And today we'd like to celebrate British football, but we can't because we're talking about the 1950 World Cup and Scotland weren't there. So, Carl, I thought they'd qualified for the 1950 World Cup. What went wrong?
Absolutely bizarre. I mean, these days, of course, it would be a matter of unbridled celebration for Scotland to qualify for a World Cup. But in 1950, they did qualify, but turned their noses up, in effect. FIFA had probably quite generously, you might say, said to the home nations that you can have two places in the 1950 World Cup, and they can be decided by 2 seasons worth of the home international championships, the
What's
British
that then? What are the
championships.
home international championships then?
So that was England, Scotland, Wales, and I nearly said Northern Ireland. It was still
I
Ireland,
think it was
wasn't
still
it?
Ireland, yes. Yeah.
In 19 for the 1950 World Championships, and so these championships are the oldest international tournament. They doubled as a World Cup qualifying group, but for some reason from the start, the Scots said they would go to the World Cup if they finished in first place, but they wouldn't go if they finished as runners up, even though FIFA were offering the two places. Uh, it was a close competition, and but England won the last game in the over these 2 years of home internationals. And so England finished top and Scotland finished second,
And
both
Wales and Northern
qualified.
Ireland, by the way, finished a long way third. I mean, they were
Yeah,
completely out of it. There wasn't any
yeah,
point in saying, well, all right, Scotland doesn't want to go, well, let's take Wales instead, because Wales was so far behind in third place and Northern Ireland in fourth that it wasn't realistic to
yeah,
do that. The curious thing about this is, it seems to me, is that this decision was taken by a member of the Scottish Football Association Committee called George
yeah.
Graham. I mean, it's a name that's going to echo down the decades in years to come. But not that George Graham, needless to say. And nobody could change his mind. The Scottish players all begged him to change his mind. Even the English captain, Billy Wright, asked him to change his mind. And it appears that he had the power to make this unilateral decision,
Very,
which was
yeah,
going to have an impact on Scottish football for, I would say, for years to come.
yeah. And it, it, it is incredibly strange, but I think it, not to excuse this very strange decision, it does show what a strange thing the World Cup was at that time, because Scotland weren't alone. That FIFA wanted an Asian team to take part, and basically all the Asian teams dropped out apart from India, and then India didn't take up their place, which I think there's been a bit of a myth developed that it was to do with them not wanting to play in football boots. I think it was actually just the expense of it. Um, all, Virtually all of Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc, didn't take part
That's right.
in
Yeah.
qualifying. The one exception, who seemed to be a very good team, was Yugoslavia,
Yeah.
uh, who made a fair contribution to the tournament when they did go. Argentina dropped out in a huff.
They did.
So Scotland weren't alone, but it was a particularly odd situation where they were perfectly prepared to go as British champions.
One
Now,
of the
whether in some,
curious features of the 1950 World Cup is that uh, essentially the two favourites for the tournament, which I think it's fair to say were Brazil and England,
hmm,
neither of them won, and they set in train then a process or a pattern where the best team failed to win. I think the best team in this World Cup was Brazil, and they were beaten in what we can call the final. We're mixing our metaphors a bit when we talk about the final. It wasn't quite the final, was it? It was more the
that's
game
right.
that was going to determine who was going to win the World Cup. They lost to Uruguay, a game they'd been sure that they were going to win. But I think it's fair to say that England were probably second favourites for this tournament. They were still widely respected. And of course, they had had a very good 5 years. The 1945 to 50 period had been really good. They had a lot of very good players, and but they weren't actually at full strength. And that brings us to our old friend Neil Franklin, who'd really been the mainstay of the English defence for the last 5 years. He played in every game that England had played since the Second World War. And in a month before, as we've talked about in other podcasts, he drops out of the picture. And so England are absolutely back on, to sort of, okay, we've got to find a centre half. And they come up with Laurie Hughes of Liverpool, who gets, these are his first and last three matches for England. He'll never play again. And the position is that they simply can't fill the position. So it wasn't just that it wasn't just that Scotland were absent. There were individual players of high quality who were missing too. And I mean, one of them was Stanley. How was Stanley Matthews? How was he not there for the first two matches that England played?
Again, that was he was on a tour of North America, wasn't he? With a different team sent out by the FA.
It seems to have been some sort of goodwill tour to Canada, and a little bit like it reminds me a little bit of a cricket tour, and I think it was a little bit like the MCC going to Australia, except of course that was the state of the art. England sending a team to Canada, but I think they sent these goodwill tours around, and evidently what had happened here was that the tour had been organised for this. I don't think the FA really esteemed this World Cup particularly.
No. I really don't think they did.
It wasn't at the top of their priorities. Other teams was completely different. Brazil, for example, they took it incredibly seriously. And
I think for Brazil, it was everything, and ended up being completely traumatic that they failed to win the tournament.
Yes, whereas I think England didn't find it traumatic at all.
No,
I mean,
not remotely the same level.
I just don't think that this really registered when they got it. It's a very interesting contrast that between the two receptions. So they're, to basically Brazil and England both underachieved. England more radically than Brazil, but yes, I mean how they reacted to those underachievements is an interesting point.
Sorry, Peter. What I was going to say is I think because it's a World Cup and what we think now of the World Cup, we look back on that and go, oh, what a disaster.
Yeah.
Because we treated a World Cup with so little significance and had terrible results. But that's maybe a back projection. I don't think is how particularly it was seen at the time.
Well, not in Europe, I don't think. I mean, I think that's maybe if it had been in Europe, maybe we would have taken it more seriously. Geoffrey Green, the esteemed football writer for the Times in these years, 50s, 60s, 70s, he notes in one of his books, a book called Soccer in the 50s, he notes that the Brazilian team, and I'll just quote this now, were fussed over by coaches, specialists, masseurs, dietists, and even, he says, a psychoanalyst. An interesting picture of how, I mean, you can guarantee, well, the English team didn't even take a doctor. I mean, it didn't even take a chef. I mean, just extraordinary. What they did take was a selector. What do we know about this selector?
Well, you would think that the person that would be selecting the team would have been Walter Winterbottom.
You would. Who was Walter Winterbottom?
England's first manager, yes. But that makes it sound as though he's the equivalent of Tuchel today. But he wasn't really, because he didn't have the same, say, over selection, which at times was done by a committee, but for the World Cup was done, I think, by just one man, wasn't it?
I think that's right. Do we know much about Arthur Drury?
Well, this is it. It's not a name that rings through the ages at all.
It doesn't resonate down the years. No. He was a fish merchant from Grimsby. I mean, it's hard to imagine a more inappropriate person. He was obviously, I mean, I think he was a bigwig in Grimsby Football Club, but he was obviously quite a political figure. And he'd wormed his way up in the FA to the point where he was on the international committee. And then if you're on the international committee, you're one of the selectors. And then when the FA accept the invitation to go to Brazil for the 1950 World Cup, they naturally assume, well, we need to pick a team, so we'll need somebody to do the picking. And that is one of our selectors, one of the selection committee. And no doubt Arthur Drury suggested himself as being an appropriate person. So he comes from a background. I mean, we shouldn't be dismissive of it, but at the same time, it's inconceivable that anyone picks the team except the manager. And to a modern football. Of course, this was one of the criteria that Alf Ramsey laid down when he took the job in 1962, 63. He said, if I'm not going to pick the team, I'm not going to manage the team. And as simple as that. And the FA had actually, they'd run out of options. They had no option but to agree that Ramsey would pick the team. But Arthur Drury took a very primitive view of how to pick the team. He, for example, England won the first game 2-0, wasn't it? 2-0. They played against Italy and they won 2-0. And Arthur Drury then, for the match against the United States, which we'll talk about now, Arthur Drury refused to change the team. I think it was a different challenge. It was actually a different location. They were moving from Rio to Belo Horizonte. And they had now a new player had arrived. Stanley Matthews had finally arrived. But Drury dug his heels in, like our friend from Scotland, and simply refused to change the team. He said, you don't change a winning team. And so the team that had beaten Chile, unimaginable really, were set out against the United States with the result that we know.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, whether the problem was exacerbated by the fact that they got Tom Finney and Finney's preferred position was right wing, which obviously was the same position as Matthews. But the thing about Finney is he was such a versatile forward that it would have been very easy to bring Matthews in and slot Finney into any one of several other positions in the team.
If you look at
that didn't happen.
Sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
No, I was just to say that, as you're saying, that didn't happen.
No.
Finney was the right winger. He played right wing in the first game. Therefore, Grimsby's finest fishmonger stuck with stuck with Finney, and Matthews didn't play.
I can see him with his weighing scales and one of those aprons, dishing out the haddock. Well, of course, there's a great Grimsby. It's a great port. Actually, Grimsby were a force to be reckoned with in those days. Did Bill Shankly manage Grimsby? I think he did. So there we are. They were touch of it came close to glory anyway. So England have lost. And by the way, one thing I was going to say is that when you talk about that front line for England, they had an awful lot of that. That's where the talent was, and it was a very talented team. But their forwards were sensational. They had people like Wilf Mannion and Stan Mortensen. Never mind Matthews and Finney and Roy Bentley, and heaps of forwards who could Jack Milburn. No, players who you think, well, you could build the forward line around them. They had about 6 or 8 of these people, and so I think that. Actually, one of the big disappointments from this World Cup, I mean, let's just briefly get ahead of ourselves and talk about the real source of the failure of England in this World Cup, was the fact that in their last 2 matches, don't want to give the game away, but they lost 1-0 to the United States and then lost 1-0 to Spain. The last 2 matches, the problem was that they failed to score goals. It wasn't that they were conceding too many goals. They were actually quite tight. They conceded 2 in the 3 matches. Altogether, but they just couldn't score. So this is a remarkable. I mean, I just out of sequence there, but it is a fact that England failed. Really, their failure was really where the strength lay, and that was up front. But we're talking about the game against. Let's talk about the game against the United States, because it obviously is one of the most notorious matches in English history. And how did they come to lose a game where? I mean, they were expected to win this 10-0. Oh, obviously, we're speaking on the eve on just having watched England labour to a 1-0 victory over Crawley Town or somebody like that, whoever they were. But it can happen. But at least England won. How did they lose the United States?
Well, I mean, it does beg a belief. It seems as though the American goalkeeper did have a blinder. There wasn't there one occasion when there was a ball that may very well have gone over the line, but it was ruled not to have done. So I think there was perhaps some bad luck on England's part, but it did just seem to be one of those games. That said, the States' first game in the tournament was against Spain.
Yeah.
And they lost that 3-1.
Yeah.
Well, they were actually leading until the 81st minute.
Yeah.
And Spain scored 3 late goals, which maybe puts the England result, with hindsight, in a slightly different light. That this American side maybe was better than it had been, and it had got a certain resilience to it, that they'd hung on for 80 minutes against Spain. So it was only, as it were, 10 minutes longer that they managed it against England.
I mean, that's an interesting parallel because they evidently had a game plan, which is get an early goal
Yeah,
and then defend
yeah,
it. And
yeah,
which of us watching England over the years has not observed just such a match? I mean, my
yeah,
mind goes back to the Poland game in '73 when
yeah,
they absolutely it was one-way traffic. I mean, I remember watching it with almost with incredulity that this Polish goal cannot continue to bear
yeah,
such a charmed life, and yet.
yeah,
Then of course, the inevitable, is that you're looking for goals. First of all, you go into these games looking for a thumping great big victory. Next, you're looking just for a victory would be nice. Then Poland score, and
yeah.
now you've got to get that goal back and get another one.
Mm.
And as Mourinho said, these teams park the bus, and I think
It
that's
can,
probably
it, it
what
can
America, what
happen,
the
and
USA did.
yeah, it can happen. I mean, any team can score one goal. I don't think there's anything surprising about the States
Do you
scoring.
think that if Stanley Matthews had been playing, I mean, well,
Yes.
go on, finish the sentence. What do you think?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I, I
I
think
mean,
it's such a freakish result that if you change almost anything, the chances are England would have won the game. But if you're talking about Matthews, uh, there was a player who could unlock a defence. So, yes, he might not have had the most all-round game. Matthews is somebody we've talked about a lot in other contexts. He was such a huge figure in English football. But in a game where England were absolutely dominant in terms of possession and territory. Obviously, we don't have the stats for it in the way we would for a game now, but England completely dominated the game, made lots of chances, had lots of possession. It's hard to believe that at some point Matthews is not going to have skinned the American left back and put a chance on a plate for his good friend Mortensen
yes,
or
yes,
Wilf Mannion,
totally agree,
uh,
totally agree.
who
Because
would have scored. It's
yeah,
hard to believe that
no, I agree.
that wouldn't have
And
happened
also,
at
you bear
least
in
a
mind that
couple of times.
what his great skill was providing assists. He laid on goals for others, and it's unimaginable that he wouldn't have done exactly the same here. Incidentally, I think we might have mentioned this before, Carl, but do you happen to know why this result, England losing to America in at football, why this result, one of the reasons why this result was perhaps accepted with a certain equanimity back in England. Do you happen to know? Do you remember what was going on exactly the same day?
This was because, of course, football isn't our summer game, cricket is, and there was rather more interest being taken in what the England cricket team was up to.
And a
Is
rather
that the case?
similar result.
Now that
It was the Lord's
now
Test of
was
1950, and
was it
England
the West
lost
Indies?
lost to the West Indies. And the first
Yeah,
time it lost to the West
yeah,
Indies at home.
yeah,
And of course, whereas the American result goes nowhere because the USA, it was a freak result. Actually, the
yeah.
West Indies result is the cricket result. We must get off cricket, but the cricket result is
No,
a
it's interesting.
really special moment because it introduces the likes of Worrell, Walcott, and Weeks, Ramadan and
Yeah.
Valentine, this team of geniuses, and so yeah, it's a funny old.
Is
It's one
that
of the
sorry,
worst
sorry?
days.
I know it's a football podcast, but is that the one where the famous calypso
Yeah,
comes from?
it is. Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
It is. And I think also because I imagine the West Indian folk who had quite a hard time in their early years in England, that must have been such a boon for the community. So, I think it's a fantastic result in many ways.
Yeah.
The World Cup result is not a fantastic result. It's a freak result and has no meaning. Other than
What I find interesting,
football.
Pete, is maybe a parallel would be we're talking about a time when very shortly there's going to be the first Club World Cup.
Yeah,
I don't think we're going to get particularly excited about what happens,
no, we're not.
but maybe 40 years from now,
Yes.
the Club World Cup will be a huge thing.
Yes.
And if people look back and say, how could it possibly have happened that Man City lost to a team from Saudi Arabia, if
Indeed.
that's what was to transpire,
Yeah.
40 years from now, that would be huge.
No.
But actually, would it be something that we take terribly seriously now? I don't think we would.
No, I don't think we'd even notice it in much the same way as England's losing in Belo Horizonte. I don't think it was really noticed. We
Yeah.
must move on. So on to the third game. So Spain have won both their games. England have won one, lost one. And I think I'm right in saying, Carl, that if England beat the Spanish, it's not
Yes.
there's no goal. It's not a matter of goal. There then has to be a playoff match. I think
Yes.
that's the regulation. So
That's
they've got to beat the Spanish twice basically because they're going to have to beat them to get into the playoff match. It's a bit like a black ball game in snooker. You got to pot the black ball first, and then you got to pot the damn thing again, and
that's right.
to get into it again.
Yeah.
And so again, anyone who's followed England in the World Cups over the years will have a long list of laments. The offside goal, the goal that was disallowed for being offside, the roughhouse treatment from the opposition, the fluky goal that was scored against them, and all these things happen in this game against Spain. And it's really another very frustrating day for England because, and add to this the penalties that were turned down. And I think
Mm.
England appear from the reports to have had plenty of reason to feel aggrieved that they lost 1-0 to
Yeah.
Spain, but nonetheless, 1-0 to Spain was the result. And I looked to see, okay, what was England's pedigree against the Spanish? So what were the most recent results then against the Spanish? And there really weren't any. They hadn't played Spain since the early 1930s. They'd lost an early
Okay.
game. They lost one in 1929 to Spain, 3-2 away. And then they had
Mm.
them at home and they'd beaten them 7-1 in 31. So they
Right.
did a whipping, but it's
Mm.
too far away. There's no connection with
There's
what
no
happened in the
form line
1950s.
here.
So there's no form exactly. And so I think the Spanish now. So then the question arises when the Spanish go through into the next round. We'll talk about that now. That how do they get on? And would England have done better? Because that is really quite an interesting question. How would England have got on if they had got through? They were knocked
Yeah.
out. They were on the way home, but Spain had got through. So now we have an unusual World Cup, and that is that we have four groups of four teams in theory, and each produces a winner. So the winner from our group is Spain, and the
Yeah.
winner from the other groups are Brazil, Sweden, and Uruguay. And they form another group in which they will all play each other once. So each team will have a further three games. So that was what England missed out on, was that they had their three games in the group. They could have had a further three in the second group, but that wasn't to be their fate. So Spain go into the next into the sort of the group of winners, and before effectively the finals group, and get absolutely overwhelmed by Brazil. And I, for one, Carl, feel a little bit relieved that England didn't get out of their group in the
Wow.
1950 World Cup because I
Yeah.
hate to think what the Brazilians would have done to us.
That's a very good point. I think it would oddly it would have been more traumatic for English football
It would,
had they got through.
because they'd have been
Because
beaten 5-0.
yeah, because as it was, I mean Brazil won their first two games. They beat Spain 6-1 and Sweden 7-1. And Sweden were a good side. So I think it's virtually certain England would have had a thumping. I
Yeah.
mean, it was a very strange World Cup because you said about how there were four groups of four teams in the first round. That's how it was planned to be.
Yeah.
But it ended up only being 13 teams. And for various strange reasons, because travel plans were already in place, the teams just fell out of the groups that they would have been in.
Yeah.
So there were two groups of four, one group of three, and probably the most bizarre group in World Cup history that consisted of two teams. Uruguay beat Bolivia 8-0, and that was that group finished.
Yeah, so there they were qualified for the final
Yeah.
group, but of course, in a way, that was not unjustified because they were a very good side that Uruguay as they went on to
Oh,
group. So
absolutely, yeah.
the cards did fall in the right way, and it wasn't the end of the world that they didn't have too much warming up to do. But nevertheless, so Spain draw with Uruguay in this final pool and
Mm.
draw 2-2, but get smashed by Brazil 6-1. And Sweden also. Now Sweden are quite interesting in our context, aren't they? We're interested in Sweden
Yeah.
because what are
Yeah.
they doing at this level of the game?
Well, Sweden, this was a very strong era for Swedish football, and actually, a result like the 7-1 defeat to Brazil, that's what stands out as unusual. They were, it seems to me, a very strong, consistent side in this tournament. Uruguay only beat them 3-2 in a very close game. A few years later, this was a Swedish side that drew away to the Great Hungarians. And they stand out to English people because of who their coach was, that they had an English coach in George Rayner, who was spoken of before. So Sweden was a country that was very much punching above its weight at that time.
Yes.
And for Brazil to beat them 7-1 shows just how incredibly powerful that Brazil team was. They were a real force going forward. They'd grown into the tournament, improving all the while. And yes, to beat Sweden 7-1, that meant this really was a powerful attacking side.
It just occurs to me actually that the four finalists, if we can call them that, none of them were really strongly involved in the Second World War, and I wonder if that is a factor that none of for example, the countries that were really involved in the Second World War, like Germany, France, England, and so forth, the problems are obvious with reconstruction.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Let's go to the final quickly before I break down with the cough.
Well, I think what's interesting is Brazil were these huge favourites because they were playing the most supreme attacking football, scoring loads of goals. Uruguay, as you said, they'd drawn one game against Spain, narrowly beaten Sweden. So on the face of it, with home advantage, Brazil were huge favourites. And yet, with hindsight, these were two South American countries that did actually play each other quite often. And I don't. So Brazil were huge favourites because they were in such good form. But with hindsight, the Uruguayans, obviously another South American country, played the Brazilians quite often. And I don't think they were intimidated in quite the same way. And there'd been three relatively recent games between Brazil and Uruguay. Brazil had won 2 and Uruguay had won 1, but all 3 were tied. And it almost makes me think it was almost as if you'd got a pair of boxers. One of them had knocked out his previous 2 opponents in a couple of rounds.
Yes.
And the other fighter had won 2 close decisions against those 2 fighters.
Yes. In fact, I think
Spain actually drew with Uruguay, but that, of course, doesn't mean that the big hitter is going to necessarily win against this crafty opponent who's got a good defence, just because he's been taken the distance by these 2.
Especially when you bear in mind that the big fighter, the favourite, is very complacent about their expectations.
Yes,
and really is fairly certain they're going to win this. And I think we learned our lesson about this. Don't take anyone for granted, and respect your opponents, and that'll be a very good project. And
the Uruguayans were tough, experienced. They weren't intimidated by Brazil. Like I said, the complacency. I mean, how much of the complacency was in the players? I don't know. There certainly was. The mayor of Rio gave a bizarre speech before the game, in which he crowned them champions, as it were, in advance of the game.
Yes, well, of course, the newspapers all delivered the result 24 hours ahead of time. And they got the result wrong because they announced that Brazil were the victors, the conquerors, and they were quite wrong about that. And I think that probably contributed to Brazil's defeat. So Brazil take the lead just after half time. A brilliant prospects in view because they're going to now just cruise to victory. But Uruguay get one back. Of course, this is not filmed, this World Cup. I don't think there's any film. I haven't seen any film of the
No,
final.
no.
So we can only go on. And then the second Uruguay's winner, the goal that really effectively, it's not a final, but it effectively wins the World Cup. 10 minutes from the end, and 200,000 inside the
Yeah.
Maracanã are left to pick up the pieces, really, because they were all absolutely expecting a Brazilian win, and it's been snatched from them.
And Uruguay, because it was a group, Uruguay actually needed to win the game, whereas Brazil only needed a draw.
Yes, of course, that's true. That is
And
absolutely
so,
true.
so when Brazil went a goal up, this wasn't like being a goal up in a regular World Cup final. It
No,
was almost equivalent to being 2 goals up.
yes, it was. Yes, because
Um,
Uruguay had to score twice, and
yes,
just so happens.
because
I wonder what the England officials and players watching the final, what they made of what they were watching.
well, the England officials weren't there to watch,
They
were
weren't
they?
there. How can that be?
Yes, because Billy Wright had thought it a very good idea that England stay on and make it a sort of a fact-finding mission to watch the rest of the World Cup, whereas the FA officials were, well, you know, what a silly idea. Let's just get back to Blighty.
Get on the plane, I think, is what the players were told. We're not sticking around for that. Get on the plane. And
Yeah.
so I think it's true. I think it's right. I mean, it would be very interesting to know what notes the FA got on the World Cup 1950, on the World Cup final, in particular on the World Cup winners, whether the FA had any notes at all on that, whether they had any information coming through, whether they had anyone
I
watching,
suspect it was just a case of this is a faraway football match between 2 lots of Johnny Foreigner
of whom
that's
we know
got nothing
little.
to do with us.
And it's 16 years then to a point where England are able to sort of embrace the world and regard themselves as world champions. And that is down to, ironically, somebody who was in the squad, of course. I mean, we assign it
That's
to
right.
Ralph Ramsey, but there is a strong connection between 1950 and 1966. If Ralph Ramsey drew any conclusion from the shambles that was, I mean, I think it's fair to say, was the 1950 World Cup, what what would he have learned then, which would have made 1966 more likely? Was it to do with preparation, I wonder? Or
Yeah,
maybe,
I would have thought definitely preparation. Um, Something that you've already mentioned, which is that the person in charge really has to be the person in charge and pick the side.
yes, selection. I think that's right. Yes.
Um, and the World Cup is something that doesn't, as it did in 1950. There it is at the end of the season with off we go to wherever we go in. No, this is something that you plan for years in advance,
I mean, I think
and
that
that's exactly what Ramsey did.
it is absolutely. And the real comparison is perhaps not with 66, but with 70, when he takes
Yeah.
England back to the scene of the crime in, as it were, in 1950. And there must have been full of memories of it because we now know when we get to our age, it's 20 years is not so long
That's
a
right.
period. And
Yeah.
Ramsey, I'm sure, must have had many thoughts of 1950 while he was running the team in 1970. And
Yeah.
among the things he would have learned were that what Geoffrey Green describes as, as a collection of what do we got here? Coaches, specialists, masseurs, dietists, and even a psychoanalyst. Actually,
Hmm.
that it's all grist to the mill, and probably a good idea to have some of those in your party. Well, that's our memory of the 1950 World Cup. I mean, I think it's a remarkable shambles on England's part, and a palpable own goal. Really, they had a great chance to stamp their authority, and they failed to take it. But really, they didn't take the tournament seriously, and we learned since
No.
that if you don't take World Cups seriously, then you don't win them. So there we are.
Yes.
And hopefully we've learned our lesson from that and there'll be many more World Cups to come. So thanks again, Carl. And
Thank you, Peter.
nice one. See you soon.